Boom! Cannons are roaring. Clang, clang, clang. Sabers are clashing. Europe is already on fire. Violence. War. And all of this is even before Napoleon grabs the reins of power. However, this historical period of time is referred to as the Napoleonic Wars. But wait a minute. Two massive coalitions had already formed against France, even before Napoleon became the ruler. So how can these be Napoleon's wars, if these are wars that he inherited? Today we're diving into the smoke, thunder, and chaos to find out how one man's name came to define an age of war that began before he even wore the crown. Ladies and gentlemen, history is not a Disney movie, contrary to popular belief. There are no perfect comic book heroes who are benevolent figures riding on white horses, and against all odds they're fighting this evil Lex Luthor villain. According to the History Channel, the education system, which is all propaganda controlled by the establishment, here's how the story goes. Napoleon was a short, angry warmonger with a Napoleonic complex. He is the reason Europe was at war for so long. He was a narcissist. He was insane. And today, when a short person is angry, that's because they have a Napoleonic complex. Really now. Boom! Let's obliterate that myth ASAP. If you just take 5 seconds to do a little bit of research, which mainstream historians don't do, they just watch the History Channel, they just read the curriculum, they rinse, regurgitate, and repeat. Napoleon was around 5'6", which for his time was average. Admiral Nelson, who was famous for being on the rum, who was a great naval hero for the British, was actually 5'4.5". But you don't hear about Admiral Nelson being short. Just Napoleon with that big floppy hat. They create a Disney caricature of an angry man with a Napoleonic complex. On top of all that, a big reason Napoleon was perceived as being short was due to British cartoonists. Boom, boom, boom. The war drums are banging. In order to galvanize the public to want to go to war, you've got to demonize, delegitimize, and dehumanize your opposition. Whether it's the false claims of WMDs in Iraq, babies on bayonets in World War I when the Germans were in Belgium, or Napoleon being the short, dumpy narcissist, that is the way you have to portray him. On the battlefield, many times he was behind his guards. People who were guards in Napoleon's army were typically tall, big bodyguards. I'm 6'1". If I'm around someone who's actually tall, 636465, by comparison, I'm going to look short. All I'm saying is these historians are lazy, they're boring, and they just regurgitate mainstream historical facts. Like, did you know Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? And he was a good guy. Did you know Napoleon was a narcissist? It's like, just come up with something new. Come up with something interesting. But I digress. Here is a quote from Napoleon. When a government is dependent upon bankers for money, they, and not the leaders of the government, control the situation. Since the hand that gives is above the hand that takes, money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a big reason why today even people who call themselves historians believe many myths, lies, and outright fabrications about Napoleon. He dared defy the bankers. Anybody that tries to go against the banking families, the Rothschild banks, is demonized. And what's interesting about Napoleon, unlike the British, who were funded by a Rothschild bank, that's the reason they're able to keep fighting and fighting and fighting, because they were funded by Rothschild banks, all these coalitions. Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory. Instead of crawling, begging the Rothschild bankers, Napoleon raised his money by selling the massive territory to the United States. And this killed two birds with one stone. On the one hand, Napoleon was able to get much needed funds for his military adventures, his military exploits. And on top of that, if Louisiana was part of France, then the British could go in that part of the Western Hemisphere. They could cause trouble. And then they could, on top of that, start a conflict with France from there. Ironically enough, Great Britain was in a war against the United States in the War of 1812. During the same time, Waterloo was happening. And some of the troops that would have been with the Duke of Wellington in Waterloo were instead in a war against the United States. It was an ingenious checkmate political move. The biggest indelible thing that Napoleon did, though, was the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code had many lasting reforms: higher education, a tax code, road systems, and sewer systems, civil law, the code law. And this was prepared by legal experts, but Napoleon was active in this. But a big thing he did was all these coalitions that were supposed to believe were good, heroic, benevolent, they were the good guys. This little short guy was the bad guy. They wanted two things. Number one, they wanted people with privilege based on birth instead of competency to be the ones who made the laws, to be the ones who ruled over the lower class. And that's why the big banks gave them money. They controlled the money supply, and then the royals were able to use that gold and rule over the plebeians. Napoleon believed in meritocracy. The best individual in the military, in civil service, the most competent, qualified person would get the job. There's a famous story when Napoleon was briefly captured by the French government before he became the leader of France. The guard treated him really well. Napoleon remembered that, and then he let the guard work for him as one of his main royal guards, essentially his bodyguard. He would sleep outside of Napoleon's residence for many years. Instead of being based on privilege and birth, he believed in that. And that's why many of his generals, commanders, people that worked in his administration were extremely qualified. It also allowed freedom of religion. And a big thing was government. See, the Bourbon dynasty, which was the dynasty that France wanted to restore back to power, they believed in people who were privileged to make all the laws. Napoleon brought in many people of humble backgrounds because they showed competency. He also had something called a Code of Criminal Instruction published, and that enacted due process. You can't just go after somebody because you think they're guilty. There's a process in place. And these reforms not only were enacted in France, but also in territories in modern-day Italy. Italy was not one unit at the time. And other parts of the empire, like the Confederacy of the Rhine that was established in 1806 by Napoleon. Speaking of which, another interesting fact. The Confederacy of the Rhine, which was the Holy Roman Empire that was created by Charlemagne in 800, it was 16 separate states. Here's the ironic part about it. By dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, reorganizing it, spreading reforms, and inspiring nationalist movements, Napoleon set forces in motion that later helped Prussia unify Germany. And here's the ironic part. In 1871, a unified Germany, the empire, was proclaimed after defeating Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew, in the Franco-Prussian War. As the great Mark Twain once said, history not only repeats itself, but it has rhythm and it often rhymes. I'm not saying the exact quote verbatim, but you understand the point. Another thing about Napoleon. We're supposed to believe that he's a warmonger. As soon as he was out of power and Louis XVIII, the Bourbon, took over again, the Congress of Vienna was established. And that allowed almost 100 years of peace until World War I. Now, a couple issues with that. In 1802, Napoleon signed a treaty. It was called the Treaty of Aime. And this was the only time France and Great Britain had peace, while Napoleon and the French government was not a monarchy. It lasted 1 year. But the British protested when Napoleon annexed part of Piedmont and had acts of mediation. And this was in the Swiss area. This had nothing to do with the treaty. But the British blamed him, and then they formed a new coalition with Russia, Naples, Sicily, and Sweden, and they went after him again. The treaty was signed, and it involved Egypt, it involved other areas, other holdings, but had nothing to do with this. But because Napoleon had another side quest going on, building an empire just like the British built an empire, they said, look at him, he's violating the treaty. We need to form another coalition. The truth is, they were just going to keep forming coalition after coalition after coalition until the monarchy was restored. It wouldn't have mattered if Napoleon stepped down and had someone else in power. They wanted the Bourbon, privileged, fat boy to rule. They wanted the royal families to rule. But we're supposed to believe they were good, heroic, benevolent heroes. But ladies and gentlemen, here's a big reason right here why Napoleon is demonized today. You can do a basic Google of this. It's not even me saying this. He had something called the infamous decree. And I'm going to read this verbatim. In 1806, Napoleon suspended all debts owed to a certain group of people that live in a country the size of New Jersey. You do the math in the Middle East. In 1808, he goes a step further and issues a decree that the moneylenders refer to as the infamous decree. It restricts the practice of lending money and annuls all debts owed by married women, minors, and soldiers. Any loan that had an interest rate exceeding 10% was also annulled. That's what our entire system is based upon. The Federal Reserve, which is not federal and has no reserves, is owned by these same people today, the same group. They loan out the money to our government at interest. Did you know the fourth largest expenditure in the federal budget, outside of Medicare and Medicaid, outside of Social Security, which I have no problem with, that's going back to people, and military spending, is interest on the debt? We're paying interest for printing our own money to these people. Why are we doing that for? Why is the Bank of England doing the same thing? Why are all these countries that went against Napoleon, that's what they were doing? And that's why Napoleon was demonized. And when you go get a loan, your entire life is spent slaving, sweating, working to pay back these banks that are owned by the same people to a certain degree. And that is why Napoleon is demonized. Another rumor you hear: Napoleon was insane. He wanted to go into Russia and make it part of the empire. No. Napoleon had something called the Continental System. Basically, wars are not just fought militarily. They are fought economically. Napoleon was a mercantilist. He attempted to form a coalition to blockade France. But even modest historians know that the Royal Navy was way more powerful, and this really affected France more. Well, at the time, Tsar Alexander I did not want to blockade Great Britain. He wanted to continue to ship in goods from them because they were cheaper than French goods. And he also had advisors that were thinking about invading Poland, which was part of the French Empire at the time. And Napoleon had people that had intelligence reports on that. So the plan was he would go in there, quickly have a fight, and then that would lead to Russia capitulating, and then they would join the continental system, they would sign a treaty, and Napoleon would leave. He never planned to make it part of the empire. He never planned to rule over that territory. He just wanted friendly relations with them. And that's what led to the War of the Sixth Coalition. But what ended up happening is Tsar Alexander had an amazing strategy. He would play a game of chicken, essentially, a game of guerrilla warfare. Instead of taking on the enemy one-on-one, tit for tat, he would retreat, much like General Washington did during the early years of the American Revolution. And that led to Russia never really fighting France. And then Tsar Alexander was ignoring Napoleon's calls for truce. But most of the people that were unalived was due to disease. It was due to the frigid, frozen, freezing winters. And they were crawling out of there. They had no food to eat. And then Moscow was burning. Boom. And then all that led to Napoleon coming back. And that was the first time that he was extradited. But they were supposed to believe he was a horrible guy. And he was a terrible guy. But you know what one of the problems is? He was able to come back. And one of his commanders, who was one of his most famous commanders, named Michel Ney, famously told Louis XVIII, I'm going to bring him back in a cage. But you know what happened? And he was one of Napoleon's most loyal commanders. When he saw Napoleon and he said, do you want to do something to your general? I can't say it because YouTube doesn't believe in free speech. He ended up dropping his weapon and he joined Napoleon. Napoleon was such a charismatic, magnetic leader who was full of inspiration and vigor that the people looked at him and said, wow. And for the famous 100 days, they joined him as their dear leader. Something else cool about Napoleon. He is the father of Egyptology. The French government at the time, this is before Napoleon was the emperor, they sent him off on a side quest into Egypt. They thought, let's send him off and we can deal with the War of the Second Coalition. It was called the Jacobins who controlled it, essentially. And they had another government after that. I forget the name of it right now. Essentially, what happened, though, when he went into Egypt, he brought with him scientists, historians, archaeologists. And he is the father. Even his critics, even the people who hate his guts admit that he is the father of Egyptology. They found the Rosetta Stone. They started translating hieroglyphics. They started bringing artifacts back to France. And this was the first time that the Western Hemisphere was exposed to Egypt. Speaking of which, Egypt at the time was controlled by the Mamluks, who were an Islamic tribe. They heavily taxed the poor. Napoleon, when he went in there, he was famous for being tolerant of different religions. Although he was a deist, he didn't have a traditional religion himself. He respected all religions. He read the Bible many times, and he read the Quran and other religious texts. He gave them what was similar to a local government today. He had consuls, where representatives would represent different districts. They would meet, and then they would construct laws. He also lowered the burden of taxation on the population, gave them freedom of religion to believe how they wanted. He created hospitals, newspapers, all kinds of things. But then his critics, you know what they say? But then he abandoned his troops. He ran away with his tail tucked between his legs, cowering, sucking on a pacifier, soiling his drawers, and he abandoned his troops. He ran all the way back to Great Britain. France. But here's the truth of the matter. This was a side quest. They sent him over there because they wanted him distracted. But then the War of the Second Coalition was about to win and restore the monarchy. So should Napoleon have stayed in Egypt while the monarchy was restored? Is that what he should have done? If anything, he had gigantic onions that drug to the ground. He got on a boat. He crossed the Atlantic. He was so popular at the time. Imagine if he was captured by the British Royal Navy and went back to France. Another myth. He didn't care. He was a psycho. If you actually read his letters, he cared deeply about people. He would remember soldiers from old campaigns. He would remember people who served with him. And he cared deeply for them. He even had a 10-day mourning for George Washington after he passed on. When Admiral Nelson, his biggest adversary at Trafalgar, passed on, he didn't like it, even though they were enemies. He even had a bust in his library made of Admiral Nelson. He also remembered people that helped him out early on. But we're supposed to believe a guy that was able to persuade an entire nation to take him back in a bloodless coup. A general that famously said he's going to bring him back in a cage. Someone who was able to get people to fight for him for 100 days. We're supposed to believe he was careless. He didn't care. He was a maniac. Last but not least, I'm going to read you this verbatim so I don't get anything wrong. Might have to censor myself a little bit because YouTube doesn't believe in the First Amendment. From his base in London's financial district, Nathan Rothschild single-handedly continues to finance Britain's war to defeat Napoleon. Shipments of gold to armies and those of British allies, Prussia and Austria. The Rothschilds' brothers coordinate their activities across the continent and develop a network of agents, shippers, and couriers to transport gold across war-torn Europe. Were it not for the Rothschilds' limitless fortune, the Allies would have been forced to have peace with Napoleon by now. After the final defeat at Waterloo of Napoleon, the Rothschilds used their advanced networks and couriers to receive the news before anyone else, which gave Nathan an advantage ahead of his peers. He orders his brokers to sell his holdings. Other brokers assumed that the Rothschilds had learned that Britain had lost at Waterloo. A panic sell drives the market down to historic lows. Rothschild then buys up the devalued market at bargain prices. When the public learns of Britain's victory over Napoleon, the stocks skyrocket to new heights. And Nathan Rothschild multiplies his fortune by 20 times. Long story short, the Rothschilds had connections. They lied and said that Napoleon won at Waterloo. He acted like he was going to sell everything. He sold some of it. That's kind of like if Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or a respected financier, Jamie Dimon, they start panic selling all their stocks. and then people get scared. It galvanizes them into selling. He buys them up for pennies on the dollar. Napoleon really won. The stocks go back up, and he multiplies it by 20. And there's actually a movie called The House of Rothschilds. It's from the 30s or 40s. I can't remember. It's a good movie. I recommend it. But they admit they do all this. It's not even a secret. This isn't even a conspiracy theory. They admit they do all this stuff. You know what Louis XVIII did? He became the king. And then his fat behind ran away when Napoleon took power. But then when Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, his fat butt sashayed back up to the throne. The first thing he did was allowed Napoleon's famous decree against usury to expire in 1818. The Rothschilds took back control. And then the Royal Bourbon dynasty, who was the good guys, ended up taking over. And instead of Europe having relative peace, they didn't have a massive war until World War I. You had the Bolsheviks. You had all these different revolutions that took over. You had Karl Marx, that was somewhat related to the Rothschilds. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. But that's Napoleon. He's demonized. He's misunderstood. And these mainstream historians are just lazy.